Welcome, everybody. I know some people are still getting settled, and I hope that you'll take an opportunity as you're getting settled to pop up also and grab some lunch. It's always a pleasure to welcome folks to the Osgoode Colloquium on Law, Religion, and Social Thought. In this instance, it's lovely also to have my Law and Religion class here. And we look forward to a really exciting, multidisciplinary reflection today from a wonderful guest in the colloquium. It's a real pleasure to host Paul Bramadat, who is absolutely one of the forces in the study of religion and society in Canada. He's the director of the Centre for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. He teaches also in the history department, in religious studies, and a kind of signal feature of Paul's work is to bring scholars from varieties of disciplines together for reflection on religion, society, the contemporary moment, but also to bridge people who are in the academy with those that are living lives connected to social policy, practitioners, and religious lives together. So Paul has been such an incredible force in the study of religion because he's stitched all of those elements together, and we're going to get a taste for that today with the topic that's drawn you here. In addition to the leadership that he's shown in the field and at the Center of Studies in Religion and Society, Paul is an absolutely prolific scholar. He's interested in secularization, in identities, in public policy. This is the most recent of a whole number of volumes that Paul has put together in that interdisciplinary way, Religious Radicalization and Securitization in Canada and Beyond. Wonderful volume, ranging broadly in disciplinary perspective and giving us real insight into the topics that are on our minds. Paul has done lots of work on immigration, on health, and we'll see some sense of that, on security, securitization, and beyond that, he's actively engaged in public policy conversations and that sort of core element of being the public intellectual. So he sits in that wonderful tradition of the genuine public intellectual, extraordinary scholar, a good friend as well, and we're delighted to have him here. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Paul. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a good amount of time for questions and conversation.
Do we want the other screen on too? Thanks, man. What a very generous introduction. Too generous. I kept thinking, boy, I'd love to meet this Paul guy. I don't know who I am. Thank you. This is the second time I've been in this room. I was here in November for a conference that Ben put on. Hi, Rick. Hi. For a conference Ben put on, and on similar kinds of themes, questions around religion in the public sphere. So I also am very pleased to have an opportunity to kind of live out one of my fantasies as an adolescent, which was to either be a lawyer or be a law professor. And I wasn't really, in my view, smart enough or ruthless enough to be either, and so I went into religious studies instead. And so, but I've finally had my opportunity to come back to another option. So, as Ben mentioned, at the center that I direct, we look at questions around religion and society. And I have kind of two roles at the center. One of them is to put together big research projects and to bring lots of different stakeholders into the room to discuss religion and society. And then I have to also carry on my own research in my own area, which as Ben mentioned, is around questions of multiculturalism, immigration, integration, refugee policy, and that sort of thing. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is really two recent projects that have come out of the center that I've directed that I think in some sense capture issues that are really at the forefront of our public conversation about religion and society. It's really quite a fraught conversation, as many of you know. I want to use the two cases, the two books that we're talking about, to reflect on, finally, on a kind of a broader intellectual social problem. I think many people who look at religion face, whether you're looking at religion from the perspective of sociology, anthropology, law, or religious studies. And then I want to finally end by thinking about, or by kind of initiating a conversation about what this kind of consideration or what these kinds of projects might be, how they might be of relevance to you guys as law students and law faculty. So the first project is really the project that found its fruition in the book that Ben held up. That was published in August or September of 2014, so it's quite a fresh book. As you can imagine, after the attacks in October in Ottawa and Montreal, my phone was ringing off the hook, frankly, because this came out and this was sort of the newest book on some of the issues that certainly the public arena was reflecting on in the wake of those attacks on Parliament Hill and elsewhere. So I want to give you kind of a bit of a thumbnail sketch of these two projects and then kind of enter into the broader conversation. So first of all, this project. So Ben mentioned that I do work with government folks in various capacities. So Citizenship and Immigration is the main body that I work with. But in this particular case, the DRDC, which is the Defence Research and Development Canada, which is kind of like an arm's length think tank of the military. Not a natural partner for me as a kind of like a far left-leaning, post-hippie punk rocker kid from Winnipeg with, socialist agrarian roots. Not like the natural people I would be, having a potluck with. So, but that crew and the people from Public Safety Canada approached me and a colleague of mine named Lauren Dawson, who's a sociologist, to put together a project on religion and radicalization. So we did that. The participants included sociologists, security scientists, that's actually their word for themselves, anthropologists, religious studies scholars, political scientists, and then senior kind of military bureaucrats. And that was actually quite an interesting thing to be in the room with them because, a lot of people in the academic world have certain ideas about what people in the government are like, what their agendas are, what their kind of habit of thought, what their hobbies are, what their agendas are. And usually we're wrong, actually. And so in fact, being in a room with these guys for a long period of time was a real eye-opener for me and for many other people in the project. So the official purpose was to study the ways radicalization might develop within particular religious and ethnic communities, and the way in which particular social contexts, especially the media, immigration policy, and government integration policies might respond to those sorts of process of radicalization. So what was my interest in this? Well, you'll see a kind of a theme here. My interest really was in kind of turning down the temperature in the conversation around radicalization and religion. Not really to deny that religion plays a massive role in many of the forms of radicalization we see in Canada, but rather to try to inform the conversation in such a way that policymakers and lawmakers and so forth could have a somewhat more cautious, critical conversation about what was really happening. I would say in some broader intellectual sense, I'm interested in teasing apart troubles and issues. Right? Some of you may be familiar with C. Wright Mills' distinction between those two things. So a trouble is a thing which besets you in your own individual life. So your neighbor is annoying, or she has really loud parties, or your professor is really hypercritical of you, or you think he's a racist, or whatever the thing is. That's your personal problem or your trouble, which very quickly, in some cases almost without even you noticing it, it becomes an issue. It's like my neighbor's Chinese. Well, Chinese people are really loud. They always have those parties. Or this particular kind of person is always racist to all people like me. Right? So here you have a kind of a trouble becoming an issue. And we see this a lot in the public and political discourse around violence and radicalization. And I wanted to try to sort of slow the conversation down, turn down the temperature, make sure we were able to distinguish in the public arena, but also in the academic arena between troubles and issues. So I just want to give you another way of looking at the purpose of the project, which is to kind of, I selected three short passages that kind of give you a kind of a flavor of what's in the book. This first one is from me, of course, the most interesting chapter. Many journalists, politicians, and representatives think of the religion and representatives of the religion tacitly agree that, insert religion here, but usually we're talking about Islam and Sikhism, is the religion of peace, but has regrettably been hijacked by a minuscule number of despicable people whose real motives are actually economic, political, and perhaps simply idiosyncratically pathological. The next one that kind of echoes this in some sense is from Ian Reader, the British sociologist, who wrote a very interesting chapter on Aum Shinrikyo, sort of a Japanese radical group, and also he also talked about American Mormon fundamentalist radicalization. He says these approaches that we usually use are ways of avoiding the awkward question of why people brimming with religious enthusiasm find it morally uplifting and spiritually rewarding to bomb and kill. And finally, from the co-editor of the book, Lauren Dawson, his argument is that we need research like this book because we need to imaginatively step beyond our contemporary secular prejudices and recognize the consequences of living a life fundamentally rooted in a faith in providence, in the active role of the supernatural in this world. So in some sense, he's trying to denaturalize a particular kind of secularism in our intellectual conversation. And so those three passages, I think, in some sense, capture what we think we're up to in this book. And now to give you kind of a sense of the main findings of the book. Originally, the military and public safety wanted us to write a book on radicalization. And I said I was interested, but I insisted on having securitization not just in the title, but in the analytical framework for the whole project. And initially they were kind of, oh, please, do we have to do that? And so the argument I made was that it doesn't really make sense to think about why does this group, Tamils or Muslims or Jews or Christians or whatever, develop hostile violent attitudes toward one particular wing of the state, without looking at the way state and society frames those particular minority communities. Right? So eventually my argument won out, thankfully, and which is good because it was a condition for the book as far as I was concerned. And it became an interesting sort of conversational thread that wove its way through the whole project, just looking at the ways in which the state and society and law frames groups and the way groups frame the state and society. That's the first kind of message, I think. The second one that we all came to really in various ways in the various chapters in the book was that it's impossible to predict who will radicalize. And I want to pause there and get us to sort of reflect on that verb itself, radicalize, right? So it's a funny verb we use without asking the question, what does it mean? Sometimes we use that word in the same way we use the verb, sunburn. I've been sunburned, like I've been radicalized. Somehow I walk outside and bam, I get radicalized. Or someone is self-radicalized, which I'm not sure what that means. Like they're at home and it's like they're sort of doing a thing to themselves, right? Or we sometimes use the term that he was radicalized in the same way we use the term he was assaulted, like somebody punched him, right? So it's either a natural phenomenon like sunburn, somebody struck you, like someone's assaulting you, or we also use the term in the same way we use the term that he got cancer. Cancer sort of came from within him. It was sort of there and needed to be turned on by smoking or by working in an asbestos-filled building or whatever, but it was kind of in there and it kind of got turned on. So it's a peculiar word we use. We use it in a number of ways, often very problematic. Anyway, long story short, it's impossible to predict who is going to radicalize. This really, really bugs people who work for CSIS and RCMP, who often come to us and say, well, we have to find some system, we have to create some system that allows us to identify who's likely to radicalize. And then, all the sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists say, no, actually, sorry, not really going to work. There's tons and tons of people who you would expect to, who never do, and the people who do, you couldn't expect in any simple, linear kind of way. And they said to me, one of them said to me once, a guy from CSIS said, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's driving me crazy. And I said, well, maybe you should start looking at the haystack, which is sort of like the purpose of the book, is to sort of give a sketch of kind of needle-haystack interaction, if you will, to put it in sociological terms. Now, when we talk about radicalization and securitization, we are typically talking about kind of big macro processes. And what are the things people are always looking for when asking about why a particular person radicalized or a group radicalized? Well, they look at employment statistics, they look at experiences of trauma, marginalization, alienation, poverty, broken homes, some state has invaded their state, dispossession, disempowerment, whatever. So those are kind of macro economic and political processes. But there's a woman named Valérie Amirault, who some of you probably know, a sociologist in Montreal, whose focus really is on what I would call micropolitics. Her argument is really that the radicalization process, if we want to call it that, begins at Tim Hortons. It begins on the bus, it begins at a cafe, it begins in ordinary human interactions with ordinary people. It's not a, people don't in grade 7 sort of start taking big courses in Islam versus the West, and they have to take a stance on that. They are rather at a playground, they are in a grade 5 class, they are, at the swimming pool, and they feel certain things, they're told certain things, they have certain small experiences, which become, these micro dynamics become very big later. So her argument is that you have to kind of get right down to that experience, which is it's a social experience in the sense that it's happening in the public arena, but it's not a macro experience in the sense that it's not about unemployment or kind of a collective trauma. Third one, problems of essentialism. This was sort of echoed in, this echoes what was in the 3 little snippets I shared with you. A really very frustrating component of the public discourse around radicalization is the extent to which essentialist views of usually Islam, but then people always jump from that to religion, as in all religions are nice when they're done right. That's the job of religion, is to be nice, to inculcate niceness, to make the world nice. But this essentialist notion of religion as such, or particular religions, really has it has a kind of political relevance. In other words, it probably makes people nicer to members of those religions, but empirically and historically, it doesn't really have much validity. So we want to trouble that a little bit. Of course, we're interested also in taking the perspectives of those who commit crimes or those who become radicalized seriously as religious perspectives. In other words, the reflex almost is to translate the perspectives of people who are committing violent acts into other motivations. He says he's doing it because he's angry at the West, or this country invaded his country, or he's unemployed. He says that, but what he's really after is sex or power, or he has a unresolved Freudian issue with his mother and father, or whatever. We tend to translate it into motivations we think we can understand. And it's important, I think, if you look at what happened in Waco, Texas, that's a classic case in why it's so important when a person is saying, look, here's how I perceive the world religiously. Here's how I perceive my place in the world as a function of my particular kind of reading of a text or a tradition, or my particular experience of the divine. You have to treat that person and those perspectives very seriously as religious perspectives, rather than translating them. As much as I appreciate the desire to translate. So now we're going to switch lanes here and talk about the second project, kind of the second case study. And that is a project on the vaccine hesitancy and refusal. So several years ago, I had a research fellow at my center for a whole year who was actually a soil microbiologist who decided he wanted to look at the history of vaccines in the West. He was fluent in Chinese as well. He's actually from Quebec, so he's trilingual, I guess. And he had spent a fellowship year in China and got interested in the kind of the history of kind of proto-vaccines in China. Anyway, long story short, he came to spend a year at the center on sabbatical, and he and I became friends and started talking about kind of the politics around vaccine hesitancy and the development of vaccines in the West from Jenner and others. And this led ultimately to this book project, because he and I discovered we had a lot in common intellectually. And so we began to draw others into the conversation, and then there was clearly a lot of interest in this. So we've just submitted the manuscript, well, just in September we submitted the manuscript to U of T Press, and we should be hearing any day now a response from them. But it's on contract with them. We're just trying to hear about publication timelines. Funding came from the CIHR, the CSRS, and interestingly enough, the Quebec Ministry of Health. Participants are, quite a wide-ranging lot: epidemiologists, historians, social psychologists, philosophers, anthropologists, religious studies scholars like me, public health MDs, pediatricians, nurses, and nursing scholars. So it was really a fascinating conversation. The purpose was really to enhance our understandings of the religious and subcultural groups that animate vaccine hesitancy and vaccine rejection, and to explain the complex ways that vaccines are developed and integrated into Canadian public policy and Canadian society. My interest is, as kind of echoing what I said before, wanting to help turn down the temperature on the conversations around vaccines, which often get very emotional very quickly, and get very ugly, in fact, very quickly, to find ways to build bridges between, if you will, the public health people who are radically pro-vaccine and the vaccine hesitant or the vaccine rejecting who are often radically anti-vaccine, to try to see if there's ways to build bridges between those two. And of course, also I had an interest in promoting public health. So if we had to paraphrase the purpose, I've actually found an interesting quotation from one of our chapters from Seth Nukin, who wrote, "What nagged at me, I realized, and he did this book on vaccine hesitancy in the United States, was the pervasiveness of a manner of thinking that ran counter to the principles of deductive reasoning that have been the foundation of rational society since the Enlightenment." Now, this experience of bafflement that he had and frustration that he had when he was talking to all the people he interviewed for his book is in some sense what fascinated me the most. Just the sense of him dealing with these others who are, mostly white, well-educated, quite well-informed people who nonetheless eschew a particular part of what he perceives to be the kind of Enlightenment legacy of Western society. And so I was kind of curious about, what kind of notions of rationality was he working with? Is there a way to kind of get beyond this sort of binary that he experienced and that he charted in his own book? He is radically pro-vaccines. And so I was kind of curious about that end of it. So this is in some sense the phenomenon or the question or the bewilderment that stands behind the whole project. I will say that almost everybody in the book they're almost all pro-vaccine people, but some of them are just very radically pro-vaccine and have no patience for people who are hesitant or cautious or rejecting. But throughout the whole process of writing the book, people softened their positions, which is generally my ambition, is to get people to be a little bit less, in a Buddhist sense, attached to their positions. So the main findings in this book, really, I would say that vaccine hesitancy is really as old as vaccines. If you look at the history of vaccines, at least in the West in the 18th, 19th centuries, right away you had people pushing back on vaccines. And using more or less the same arguments one hears now. If you just Google vaccine and safety, you'll get all kinds of stuff. But there's questions around what's natural, what is natural, what is a chemical versus what is in the body. Vaccine safety was a big issue in the 18th, 19th centuries. Questions around an overzealous government that wants to take away your autonomy. Those are big issues back then, as they are even now. And also religion, notions of what God wants for your body, whether God wants chemists and pharmaceutical companies to be messing around with things that ultimately get squirted into your body. So those kinds of concerns are actually historical concerns and concerns of today. They are articulated somewhat differently now than they were a century ago, but they are still more or less the same kinds of concerns. Second thing that was pretty clear from the research, and that many of you perhaps know, but vaccines are safer than they've ever been. The kind of evidence of their efficacy, the evidence of their value in kind of public health historically it's sort of like climate change. It's kind of like virtually all scientists are quite, there's quite a strong consensus among them about their value. But they're not risk-free. Right? Nothing's risk-free or doubt-free or problem-free. There are risks. There are adverse effects. There are serious side effect concerns. Those are not real. Those are not all imagined. But in fact, I have to say, for me, one of the most profound chapters in the book is probably the chapter which most people will find driest because it's written by public health scholar and not somebody who's a natural writer, but it's really about adverse effect monitoring. So what happens when you get a flu shot and all of a sudden your left arm goes numb, or all of a sudden you break out in hives, or some kind of thing that they don't really want to happen happens, especially if it's a new, unusual thing. All of your hair falls out, or whatever it might be. And she works for the BC CDC, the Centre for Disease Control. She's one of the vice presidents there. And she kind of just takes you through what happens when you come in and your hair is, gesturing, you have no more hair left. You just got the flu shot innocently enough. You were told by your nurse and all your friends to get the flu shot. You get it, your hair falls out. Well, they start a file on you and other people whose hair fall out, and they start to look for all kinds of explanations. And it's a very aggressive, very, I have to say, very, in some sense, poignant kind of aggression. They really pursue it hard. So that was a very interesting finding, and I think in some sense it was for me the most powerful chapter, because it just sort of says, look, a lot of the anxieties we have about big pharma or the kind of vaccine establishment, if you will, once you get behind it and you actually meet the people who are involved in the research and the promotion, it's much harder to maintain those kind of images of big pharma. Just like when you get behind the security establishment and you meet the actual people who are in charge of making sure no one walks into Tim Hortons with bombs strapped to their chest, you kind of have a different sense of what they're up to. And again, I think it ought to lead to a little bit more humility. Third, we found that a vaccine is a kind of a product of both rational and non-rational forces. I have to say, one of the most painful and yet beautiful moments for me came when we had a meeting of all of the authors in the book, and we invited another 15 or 20 stakeholders from Ontario and Quebec for a meeting in Montreal a couple of years ago. And so it was a very good meeting, talking about the existing research on vaccines, the kind of things we do and we don't know. So we had this interesting moment on the second day of the meeting. A woman stood up in her mid-50s, I guess, and she said, my name is so-and-so, I work for the Quebec Ministry of Health. I have an MA or an MSc in epidemiology. I work in promoting vaccines and other kind of public health measures. I know all the research back and forth. I can read it probably better than anybody else, she says. And so she's telling the story, and then she pauses and she looks out the window and she says, but I have a 12-year-old son who has severe autism, and my life is hell. It was unbelievable. She said, from the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes to sleep, that's all I'm thinking about. And his life is hell, my life is hell, it's awful. And then another pause, and she said, and I'm not 100% sure that I didn't cause this by getting him the MMR vaccine. So it was one of those moments where she said, I know the research on, so the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that kids get. The reason that the story around the link between MMR and vaccines emerged because the first indicators of autism tend to emerge right around that time in a kid's life. And that's what happened in her son's case, and then it just got worse. He has one of the worst forms of autism. So she wasn't, even though she knew intellectually, scientifically, that the evidence is quite clear that there is no causal link. And that, in fact, the main person who promoted this notion of a causal link has been totally discredited, disbarred, if you will, to use lawyer language. So he has been, cast out, as it were. She can't quite put that anxiety away. And so she lives this terrible, painful life in some respects, where she's promoting vaccines in the day, going home to her son who has a football helmet on because he smashes his head into everything. Not really sure if maybe she did it. So this question of the combination of totally legitimate concerns people have about vaccine safety and the purity of the vaccines and the way they're rolled out and the way they're funded, and all those are totally legitimate concerns to be talking about, coupled with all kinds of, extra rational concerns that people develop. Second, there is a distinction in the book and in public discourse between kind of capital R religious and small c cultural reasons to be hesitant about or to reject vaccines, right? So The capital R religious ones, where your imam or your priest or your pastor says don't get vaccinated, because there are a number of reasons for that. Either the vaccine contains something from an animal that you don't want in your body, that it contains some tissue from a person you don't want in your body, from aborted fetuses that you don't want in your body, or that you're interfering with God's will. If God wants you to get diphtheria, you'll get diphtheria. Sorry about that, but that's part of God's plan for you to have diphtheria. Right? So there's a variety of kind of capital R religious reasons that people don't vaccinate, but those actually, if you took all the vaccine hesitant or the vaccine rejecting people in the world, that's actually very rarely the official reason people give. Okay? It is in sort of, when we have sort of flourishing of measles or mumps in the Fraser Valley, it's usually attributed to conservative Protestant groups, but typically vaccine hesitancy is what we call cultural, which is more of the kind of, how can I put this, sort of the granola hippie alternative healthcare perspective. People who are suspicious of big pharma and big medicine and so forth. Part of what I wanted to do in one of my chapters for the book was to ask a question about whether it's, although those two things, the religious reasons and the cultural reasons, it's a reasonable thing to distinguish between those two things analytically, but is there some value to actually asking where those two things overlap? And my contribution to the book was really to ask, well, if a person has concerns about the safety of a vaccine, and I present that person with 57 studies that show that concern isn't scientifically well-founded. In fact, we've already answered that question. And the person continues to believe that the vaccine is tainted or whatever, then you've got something else going on there. It's not unlike the when prophecy fails literature. What happens when this rabbi who you think is the Messiah and is about to announce that he's Messiah, then he dies and he doesn't announce that he's the Messiah, or the Messiah you think is going to come back next week on Tuesday at about 12 o'clock in Etobicoke, and he doesn't, or she doesn't. What happens, right? When prophecy fails, when a big expectation you have fails, when a commitment you're deeply enmeshed in fails, well, actually, the religious groups just kind of keep on going. There's a variety of ways they do that, but they kind of keep on going. So this is not unlike what happens with vaccine hesitancy. So the MMR autism link, that is the biggest, most common link people make, or false attribution people make. It's been proven incorrect, a number of ways in a number of different publications around the world, and yet people still cling to it. So is there some way in which that is similar to the way people still cling to a religious perspective when all the explicit expectations you had that the Messiah is going to come back next Tuesday in Etobicoke don't occur? So, and part of the argument was that there is something at work there which is similar in the religious and cultural expectations. Also, originally the people who were kind of the white coat component of the project were not too sure about the value of the project. They said, look, you know what, these religious people and kind of hippie folks who don't want to vaccinate, we just can't even talk to them. So we're just going to write them off and spend our time and our money and our energy convincing people who are maybe incompletely vaccinated to get completely vaccinated. So we're just going to write them off. And they just threw up their hands and said, these people are crazy, Paul. We cannot talk to them. So part of my mission, if you will, my mandate was to say, actually, you can talk to anybody. It is the job in religious studies, it's probably the job in law to be able to talk to anybody, right? To be able to cross bridges and boundaries. And that was part of and I think we were successful at convincing them that was possible. Also, just numerically, roughly 5% or so of vaccines don't work, they don't take for whatever reason. There's a small number of people who can't be vaccinated because they're either too young, too old, too sick. And then there's people who are absolutely never going to vaccinate. That's maybe a couple or 3% of people. And then you have the vaccine hesitant, which is maybe like 8 to 20% depending on the vaccine. You add all those numbers up, it's big. That's too big for herd immunity. You no longer have a problem. You can simply say, look, I'm not dealing with those people. They're crazy. They're evidence averse. So I convinced them to kind of take it more seriously because the numbers suggest you have to take it more seriously because at some point these things are going to come back if we don't increase herd immunity. And then finally, I think with this project, one thing I found most interesting is that I mentioned the sort of off the cuff that you give people 57 studies about how the MMR autism link doesn't exist, and they still believe it exists. So, and this drives epidemiologists and public health people crazy because they all have MSCs and PhDs. They're super smart people. They know how to get studies funded, and the studies are generally proving the same thing over and over again. And yet, vaccine hesitancy is going up. So they're like, what? Maybe we just need better bus shelter ads. Maybe we need better pamphlets. Maybe we need better FAQ sections on the CDC's website. So they're just freaking out, like, what is this about? So most research tends to suggest that it's not more data that is necessary, more or better data, or better charts, or better bus ad campaign. It's actually longer-term relationships with physicians and nurses. Okay, so that when a patient comes in and says, yeah, I think vaccines are not natural, I'm going to give my kid whole milk or breast milk until she's 16, and she'll be fine, right? Or whatever, okay, or homeopathy. And many doctors or nurses just kind of go, okay, I can't, next, we'll just not talk about that. We'll just bracket that because that's clearly an irrational thing in your mind, and I'm going to focus on your smoking or your bad knees or whatever, something I can actually help you with. It turns out that actually just maintaining the relationship over a long period of time, being patient, being engaged, being critical, being objective, but also being patient and dialogical is the most effective approach. So I've talked about two very different projects, right? Public health, public safety. Are there any common threads? So I think there are some common threads. I want to make sure we have a good amount of time to talk about them. So some of you have you had Lori here? Some of you may have heard about the concept of, or maybe have read some of Lori's pieces on deep diversity. The idea that we need to reimagine Canadian society in such a way that people of all ethno-racial, religious, sexual, whatever resentations or communities can feel a part of Canadian society in a way in which it's not what she resents really is the idea that sort of the dominant white male community is sort of bestowing privileges on minority communities. She really resents that. And she wants to encourage a more deep diversity, which is, many of us have said that's all fine and well, but what does that actually mean kind of on the ground? Because in some sense, the challenges I'm talking about in these books on public health and public safety are the darker, the more problematic forms of diversity, right? It's one thing to say, look, this established white community in Canada has trouble seeing a turban on an RCMP officer or a hijab on a judge. And how do we deal with that? Well, those are challenging for many people for lots of reasons that are definitely worth talking about, and people have talked about these things at some length and in some depth. But in some sense, I guess I want to argue that the kinds of problems that we're talking about, public health and public safety, actual violent radicalization on the one hand, and the return of polio or mumps or measles or rubella, diphtheria, et cetera, on the other hand, these are real problems. In other words, these are problems that it doesn't really matter what your perspective is. Whereas, whether you think the hijab or the turban is a problem in the public arena depends on the kind of person you are going into it. But if you have diphtheria, you don't have to have an opinion about diphtheria. You have it and you don't want it. It's a kind of a deeper, darker problem of diversity, I think. I don't mean ethnic diversity, I just mean all kinds of diversity, cognitive as well as ethno-racial, religious diversity. We see also, I think, two different kinds of crises, and I want to talk a little bit about these. Trust and truth, the crises of trust and the crises of truth. Now, look, the lines are quite blurry between these two, but I think it's worthwhile to ask, when people are entering into either hesitant or resistant attitudes toward vaccines, or angry, radical attitudes toward the dominant society in the case of radicalization, we see deep down crises of truth and trust. So some of you will remember this. This was not his finest moment. And that is not his chapstick that he's holding up. Does anybody remember what this picture is from? It's when, the weapons of mass destruction argument, we have to go in because there are these weapons of mass destruction. In something this small, you can do terrible damage. Turns out not to really have been true, but it did create a bit of a string. So there's, we're not going to go into the data now, but you'll have to trust me, as it were, that there's a fair bit of evidence that there is kind of a declining levels of trust that we have in one another and in our state entities. Now, how do we see this in the radicalization project? Well, we see declining or kind of a threat to public trust in security services. Think about Abu Ghraib, think about Guantanamo Bay, think about Meher Arar. In politicians, think Mike Duffy, obviously. In the media, in pundits, in NATO, the UN, even among some people in the World Health Organization and NGOs who deliver vaccine overseas. And then in the vaccine project, we see similarly a decline in trust in physicians. This is quite well established. In symbols of patriarchy, which is why I chose this good-looking fellow. My doctor doesn't look like that, but I'm sure some of yours does. But so it's actually one of the interesting stories in one of the chapters in the book was about HPV, the HPV campaign at university campuses. Many of you are familiar with that. And it was very interesting vis-a-vis the second bit here about all symbols of patriarchy. There was this very interesting story told by this ethnographer who studied these women and their relationships with the doctors on campus. And the doctors were promoting HPV vaccinations for human papillomavirus, and which causes cervical cancer in some cases. And at one point, this woman is sort of describing her interaction with this male doctor, where he asks her about her sexual history and her sexual activity, and he says, well, given what you told me, you are at risk for contracting this disease, which might develop into a very serious cancer later on. And so it's probably in your best interest to get this vaccine. And she said no, and she pushed back against him quite hard. And he said, oh, okay, well, I'm going to write you the prescription anyway for it, and if you change your mind later on, you can get the shot later. That's how she described it. Okay, that's her description. But then in her description that's her sort of, as it were, transcript of that interaction. And then she says, but he was essentially mansplaining to me, as some of you have heard this term. He was sort of using this powerful white coat man doctor thing. You are sort of sexually promiscuous. You must do this. And I kept saying, as I was reading the draft of this chapter, I kept saying to the authors, actually what the doctor did was sort of standard doctor stuff. She is technically at risk for this illness. This is the vaccine for this, to prevent this illness. She said no, he gave her an option. And yet, she walked into that interaction as a younger woman confronting this guy, probably this guy's dad. And she felt this guy, again, who had a certain kind of male authority aura, she felt he treated her poorly, even though in fact her actual description of the interaction didn't bear that out, right? So there is, in other words, this crisis of trust in these figures that have very little to do with what they actually do. You kind of can't win as a doctor when you're talking about certain things, especially if you're a white male talking to a younger woman who was, in her case, a very well-educated young woman who was sort of pre-loaded or geared already to interpret whatever he was going to say as being anti-feminist or anti-her, at least. So, crisis of trust in big pharma, big government, big business, big medicine, all the bigs, anxieties of trust. Now, crisis of truth that one sees in the radicalization project. Again, these are related, of course, to the trust question. Can we trust any truth claims that come out of or that are in any way tainted by or related to what we might think of as imperialisms or colonialisms or any kind of imperial project or colonial project? And since, if you're well trained in a liberal academic tradition, you will, by the end of your 4 years, come to believe that everything that we're involved in, every institution, every neighborhood, every city, every grand project we're involved in, is ultimately a project of imperial and colonial entities, and reflects a particular kind of notion of the civilizing mandate of the white European powers as they expanded their grip on the rest of the world. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know or don't feel, but the point is that within communities that become radicalized, there is an awareness of the deep shortcomings of all imperial and colonial projects. Many of the people who end up radicalized, whether it's self-radicalized or other radicalized, articulate these frustrations about these sort of dominant discourses, even if they don't use that term. There is, of course, in some sense, the more mundane or the more obvious critique of the role of oil and money in our foreign adventures. The end of the sort of noble war, the World War II-ish kind of war. Now the beginning of these wars of not just conquest, but single resource conquest. Hence Colin Powell and his chapstick. So crises of truth give way to this anxiety about what we can trust as well, right? WikiLeaks, of course, and the work of Anonymous are also heightening our anxiety or heightening our awareness of some of the shortcomings of these broader discourses of imperialism and colonialism and so forth. In the vaccine project, where do we see the crises of truth coming from? So many of my students, I'm sure many of you, many of your students and younger friends, talk about other ways of knowing as if it's, and relativism, as if these things are sort of self-evident. Every 19-year-old knows going into university, or at least by the time they're in second or third year, they know that there are many ways of knowing. That anybody who tells you that there's one better way of knowing, whatever the knowing is about, is wrong, is promoting a particular kind of hegemonic discourse, right? That's the way we like to talk about it. And that is, probably true. But this notion, this kind of relativistic notion, is, on the one hand, one of the great benefits of a liberal education. On the other hand, it has created all kinds of problems for people in public health because it has lent to people who have these anxieties a tremendous amount of authority, which they wouldn't otherwise have had within a more kind of positivistic framework. And of course, anybody who is a physician or a nurse will tell you that the internet has been wonderful for circulating information about your body and illnesses. But it also means that people, when they go into the doctor's office, often they think they already know what's wrong with them. Because they've already Googled like rash plus limp plus hair falls out plus hiccups. Oh my God, I've got Asperger's plus epilepsy plus, Seriously, my wife is a physician and she has people come into her office all the time and simply say, look, she's a psychiatrist, look, we don't need to do this whole interview thing. I'm pretty sure I have bipolar disorder, and I looked at the most recent journal of blah, 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 or a blog on blah, 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 and I'm pretty sure I need 15 milligrams of such and such every second day. And it's like, wow, and seriously, this happens very, very frequently. So that's a wonderful thing, to have that much access to that much information. Also kind of a problem for any kind of, if you will, discourse of authority. Right? Okay, yes, you've gone to the blog and it looks like you have epilepsy plus narcolepsy plus autism and, but maybe we can actually just slow this down a bit and have a longer conversation and see if there's something there. So, underneath it all, if in fact we are seeing pervasive crises of truth and trust, and crises of a particular kind of secularism, which I think is also at work here, this kind of problems with deep, dark diversity, what kind of existential question might this pose for us? And here's kind of one of the main points I want to make, is that we are facing a problem related to a basic desire many of us have to live in a single world, to live in a world in which we share a space and a cognitive space as well as a physical space with other people. So they, if you will, both people who turn out to be violently predisposed toward the state or society, as well as people who don't want anything unnatural put in their bodies, often say they want to live in a world in which everybody would accept their definitions of the good and the true. They want to live in harmony with a divine or natural order in the universe. Bruce Lincoln talks about maximalism. In the case of radicals, religious radicals, there is a sense in which religion, some kind of single notion of a divine cosmic order, organizes all aspects of their lives. It is not outside of their lives. It is not a thing they do on the weekends. It is the single overarching organizing force. But similarly, you can actually find many people in the anti-vaccine world who also live within a maximalist framework, where being natural or having a simple, low-tech, natural response to all health concerns you might have, whether it's homeopathy or whatever it might be, is similarly the overarching single discourse or umbrella within under which their lives unfold. So they want a single world. They fear that members of the dominant society are intransigently resisting the emergence of this true and singular world at our collective peril. Mark Juergensmeyer, great sociologist of religion, talks about one thing he finds in common among Christian militants, Sikh militants, Muslim militants, many of whom are in jail, and he interviews them there. He said, everybody at some point says, Professor Juergensmeyer, what you don't get is that we are all living in a cosmic war. There are no innocents anywhere. You just don't know you're a soldier. I do, and I know I'm on the right side, and I know God commands me to kill an abortion doctor or to invade this or to blow up that. So this notion of there being something deeply, deeply wrong about the world in which we live, and they are kind of cosmic warriors who are going to correct this, is a very common sensibility. Of course, these desires and fears are not just theirs. I also want to live in a common world characterized by at least apparent diversity, under which we would all share a basic commitment to equality, respect, reason, democracy. So here you see my own latent tendencies toward, liberal secularism, not so latent actually. This is, in a sense, my sense of the natural order of the universe, right? Just to be very honest. And I fear that such a world may be impossible. I fear that anything like democratic rationality, in the end, under the forces we've been talking about, under a kind of a deteriorating trust and truth regimes, and also kind of particular challenges to particular kind of secularism, a kind of rigid, closed secularism we have, I fear this may lead to kind of a neurotic fascism or a nihilism of some sort. And that's a deep concern for me. Many of one of the other arguments that has been made in both projects, actually, the Radicalization and the Vaccine Project, is the power of the internet. I mentioned this with respect to the health discourse, but the web, what often happens when people end up being arrested for radicalization or for plotting a terrorist attack here or there, they always interview the hockey coaches and the math teachers and the neighbors and the ex-girlfriends, and they do that whole thing. And everybody says this: they were always such nice boys. I had no idea, right? Partly because they don't live in Etobicoke. They're physically there, but they are not always mentally there. But that is the case for all of us, right? Some of you who have deep attachments to other places or other kind of virtual communities also know what I'm talking about. So this is why people say, well, they were always such nice boys. Well, the reality is that people under 45, let's say, I'm now 47, so I'm putting myself on the other side of the line. People under 45 know this about the internet. They know that it is not a place, it is not just a fast phone, it is a place. And that's an important distinction. The people in the security services and the people in public health see it as just a very effective telephone or a really good mail service, right? But the people who are living in their basement in Etobicoke actually living quite happy middle-class lives, going to play hockey and getting decent marks in school and being otherwise normal, having a job at Tim Hortons, just otherwise a normal kid from Etobicoke. I hate to pick on Etobicoke. Is anybody here from Etobicoke? Sorry. I just like saying Etobicoke. Yeah. Okay, I'll choose another place. Duncan, oh. So they appear to live in Duncan. They appear to be well integrated. They're just like every other boy. It's almost always boys, interestingly, but that's another topic. But they only appear to be there. And that is an important distinction. But it's also because the internet has created this additional space in the world, which is wonderful in many ways, but it does lead to the kind of fragmentation of anything like a common world. When I used to teach religion and pop culture classes, and I would come into the class in the morning on a Friday, and it was just after Thursday, which is when everybody in the class would have watched Frasier, Seinfeld, ER, and Friends. And I could make a joke about what Ross did last night, or what Rachel, and everybody got it, because everybody was watching the same thing. That's not the case anymore, as you know. That is not the case. We do not have that kind of common popular world, and that was in the 90s, right? But those kids who were in the classes were born in the 70s, or in the early 80s. So, just by way of kind of almost wrapping up, if the problems that we see with religious radicalization and vaccine hesitancy, which don't normally get put in the same sentence, point to the problems inherent in the yearning for a common world, or at least point to its likely disintegration, or maybe even its impossibility. And if this lack of a common world is a bona fide problem, that is to say, it's not just a problem for totalizing ideologies like capitalism or a particular kind of liberal democracy, and it's not just a problem for markets, if it's a real problem, then perhaps we should be good pluralists or postmodernists and forego the whole drive towards such a common world. Maybe that's a natural conclusion of these analyses. Maybe we should treat the whole common world drive as a vestige of positivism or imperialism or Orientalism or any other of the badisms that we're all taught to say are badisms. Maybe that's the case. Maybe we should say enough with the common world business. We want many worlds. We have had enough common worlds. So should we renounce? So on the one hand, it seems to me, maybe we should. Maybe there are different ways of knowing that have been, not maybe, obviously there are different ways of knowing that have been under somebody's boot for a long, long time. I think, the public reckonings we've had over various kinds of policies and agendas in our culture have certainly shown this. So too has postmodernism, postcolonialism, feminism, liberation theology. All of these interpretations, all of these arguments have shown that there are real benefits to simply celebrating different ways of knowing that one sees underneath both radicalization discourses as well as vaccine hesitancy. But on the other hand, maybe not. Maybe actually our openness to different ways of knowing is superficial. It appears to be deep, but it's not so deep. Maybe actually there is a tacit consensus around the truth that no one wants to acknowledge. Maybe we kind of assume that these other ways of knowing will not really catch on. Like it's not like there's people are going to all of a sudden, have an entire polity switch to a kind of a Islamic radical, Christian or Sikh or Muslim perspective. It's not as though people are going to give up vaccines altogether, right? Maybe we actually just are humoring in a kind of paternalistic way those who are attached to other ways of knowing because we think of them as kind of quaint, peripheral, marginal discourses. To me, the problem here is that in the particular cases I'm talking about, that in the cases of radicalization and vaccine-preventable epidemics, which are likely to happen if vaccine hesitancy continues to climb as it's climbing, the stakes are very high. It's not imaginary. And in fact, the victories in Europe of kind of right-wing nationalist or nativist groups should remind us that these attitudes are not latent. They're not really minority views. They're actually the views of a lot of people in lots of places still. So these things have not gone away. So the idea of polio returning, the idea of measles and whooping cough and other quite dangerous illnesses increasing, these are not trivial things. These are not kind of just things we can just adjust to lightly. I can guarantee you, if we start seeing these illnesses come back in a serious way, you will see people all of a sudden, that 15% of hesitant people returning to the doctor's office right away, even if your hair falls out. God forbid that should happen. But so what keeps me awake at night? just to return to me, because it's all about me. This is a piece from Talal Asad that I used in my chapter. If Europe cannot be articulated in terms of complex space and complex time that allow for multiple ways of life and not merely multiple identities, right? This is important to flourish. It may be fated to be no more than the common market of an imperial civilization, always anxious about usually Muslim exiles within its gates and Muslim barbarians beyond. Okay? It seems to me we are at a point where we need to find some way to reimagine our cultures in ways that can, on the one hand, pay appropriate respect to those other ways of knowing and appropriate respect to those who have been silenced for so long without sort of, reifying them into little identity camps, and with also in a kind of creative way. So then, what is this is a trigger warning for you, what is the minimum requirement for a common world? It seems to me, this is my last slide, it seems to me it is telling the truth, first of all. Okay? So again, this is idle amateur speculation. I'm probably in a room full of people who know a lot more about TRC processes than I do. So obviously there are problems with TRC-like processes, with the idea of telling the truth as sort of the beginning point for a common world in which we might share a life together. Obviously the problems of TRCs are many. Who is telling what kinds of truths and what kinds of contexts, with what sorts of justice mechanisms in place, et cetera, et cetera. Still, I think that by now this is sort of Ignatiev's bumper sticker, or at least one of them. He says in a very profound essay he wrote that the past is an argument, and the function of truth commissions, like the function of honest historians, is simply to purify the argument, to narrow the range of permissible lies. Something I really, not so crazy about everything he said, but that I think was fairly compelling. So, truth-seeking processes, the notion of telling the truth, finding a way to share in the telling of some truths about colonialism, about public health errors in the past, about the complex history of vaccine development in the West. There is something to be said for these kinds of truth-telling exercises, or at least these truth-telling reflexes. I think they're desirable in a situation where coercion is necessary, where things get so bad with regard to the return of a particular disease that we have to have mandatory vaccines, or we have to have new security measures if things ever got that bad, and or let's say other new security measures, because things are already moving in that direction. And I think this kind of truth-telling process is more compelling also when minorities have clear and demonstrable grounds for being disgruntled about this sort of status quo regime vis-a-vis public health and public safety. Now, I mentioned I was going to end with, I'm kind of an end on a happy note kind of guy. So, what can we all do to help address this, if you see it as a dilemma of this common world? What can we do to help address the dilemma of the end of this world, or the potential end of this world? I guess I would say, again, I would say that our job together is to try to narrow the range of permissible lies and to insist on the possibility of this common world, especially with respect to public health and public safety. I think it's a really important objective of our research and of our teaching and of our community building too. Now, it won't be enough, I think, but that doesn't mean we don't do it anyway. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Fascinating blending of two projects and set of thoughts at the end. We have about 20 minutes for questions, queries, pushes, or clarifications. I have a couple of mics and I'll walk around. I've got a bunch, but I want to defer to you all about questions you might have for Paul, comments you might have about the presentation.
Oh, the people I infected. Sorry. It's always them.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the radicalization process. I was wondering, do you think there can be something almost like a de-radicalization process? Like these ideas that come to people to make them radical in whatever way. Do you think that there could be a process to change these? Do you think it's appropriate to do that if we're supposed to, respect people's not just identities but their worldviews, is it appropriate to change those? And do you think if it is appropriate, is it because we justify it based on safety concerns or security concerns? Like, is there a hierarchy of people's views and public safety that one outweighs the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a number of societies, especially in the West, who are quite a lot more advanced than we are in responding to that very issue. De-radicalization programs, as they're officially called, in a number of countries, Denmark, UK, and France, are actually quite well advanced compared to ours. We are still kind of fumbling around, not really sure what to do. I'm not really sure why we're fumbling around, why we have such a weak, kind of limping a response to it. We tend to have it's probably because of the political party in control federally, that they have more of a sort of law and order approach to it and are less likely to adopt a more creative dialogical approach. So the Danish government, when someone comes back from Syria and they know they've been involved, they haven't been sightseeing, they engage them actively in more, if you will, more positive conversations. So yes, I think we have not just that we should have an open conversation. I mean, having said that critical stuff I just said about the Canadian approach to it, the RCMP is actually quite good at getting out and talking to local religious communities, mostly Muslim and Sikh, about members of their community who are, by all appearances and by all accounts, moving in a direction that is likely to end up in them going to Syria or them doing something violent here. So they actually have a lot of outreach programs, but it just hasn't yet organized itself into kind of a single thing. But I think philosophically and politically, it's quite appropriate to do so. As long as it's not draconian and it's not kind of punitive, right? So if a person ends up coming back from Syria alive, we should celebrate that he's come back alive. It's almost always going to be a he, almost always. And engage them, right, rather than sort of locking them up. And there are better and worse ways of doing that, I think. But I think that to me, it's not that difficult to justify morally. It's difficult to execute in a way which would be consistent with legal expectations.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So these are just for recording, Abigail, and you have a question. Bruce has a question as well. I saw a couple other hands. If you can just catch my eye, I'll be sure to get you a microphone. So.
Yes, thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not you think that a Canadian style of multiculturalism is conducive towards this truth-telling that you're describing, or if there's a better system out there that you've come across.
Yeah, I'm at the risk of sounding like kind of a cheerleader for multiculturalism. I kind of feel like I am. I mean, it has lots of shortcomings. It has failed to deliver in many ways, and there are lots of kind of, not loopholes, but there are lots of sort of spongy parts to it. First of all, multiculturalism is both a discourse, a policy, a kind of a cultural reality. It is, and it is an act as well. So it's at least 4 different things. So it's got some problems in it. But I think when you compare us to other societies around the world and throughout history, as a framework, those 4 pieces of those 4 kind of expressions of multiculturalism are probably the best framework within which one might tell stories like this, tell truths like this. What you need is an activist government or a more progressive government that is willing to say, look, we have this great 4-piece thing called multiculturalism, the discourse, the reality, the policy, and the act. Why don't we use it in a way which is more creative, right? Where it's not kind of always playing second fiddle to kind of a law and order discourse. So yeah, I do think it is it is a good framework. It is not the only framework one needs, because part of the sort of TRC-ish sort of approach one would want to have is to say, this kind of argument that Canada is all about, law and order, peace, good governance, peace, order, and good governance. That is a kind of a lovely bumper sticker, but it is, as you know, it glosses over lots of pretty dark history. First of all, what we've done with First Nations people, and second of all, our involvement, more recently, our involvement in other parts of the world and our kind of uncritical approach to other societies. So that needs to be said out loud, because many of the people who are in Etobicoke or in Duncan, who are furious at the government, say this is all a lie. This sort of peace, order, government thing is a lie. We stole the land from First Nations people. We continue to be involved in foreign adventures. and we continue to tell untruths about it. Someone just needs to say that. Hearing that, I mean, one wouldn't expect the prime minister to say that probably, but saying that out loud in some kind of forum, under the aegis perhaps of multiculturalism, would at least help, I think. So, now, I'm not a government official, so I can say that, right? It's the job of an academic to act like this, and of a government agent to say, I'm never going to say that. So, Bruce.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Paul. That was terrific. I felt like we had the privilege of benefiting from many years of good thinking and great collegial work, and somehow you packed it all into an hour. So I'm very, very grateful to you.
Thanks.
So many thoughts provoked by your presentation. And let me just ask one. When you talk about the possibility of a common world, not used to thinking in that language, and it's just a bit taken aback by that way of expressing our challenge in broader terms. And I'm just curious, because I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean by that. I don't think you mean a shared cosmology. I don't think you mean shared values or attitudes. I mean, I don't really know what it means. For me, it would just mean a shared commitment to advancing the conversations that you're seeking to advance, to try to build bridges between different communities and different ways of thinking about the world, I think is a very useful way of addressing our challenges, and a shared commitment to nonviolence, perhaps a shared commitment to working within existing political institutions and in compliance with the rule of law, but a shared commitment to the importance of constantly critiquing and seeking to transform the parts of our shared institutions and rules that we disagree with. I'm not sure that's...
I like that.
That's kind of the way we would tend to think about it in a law school.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, from your perspective, when you talk about the possibility of a common world, what are the ingredients of the shared commitments and the rooms for, and the spaces for disagreement that you imagine?
Thank you. I think the second or third last thing you were listing there was sort of what I have in mind. So for you and me, it's easy to say, well, what we all at least need to have at a minimum is a commitment to the rule of law and to sharing institutions and to working within the existing structures of the world as we see it. And that I can kind of go, okay. And there are a variety of ways one might do that. One might have a very radical leftist perspective and still work within that world. One might have a very radical right perspective and still live within that world and agree not to kill each other when we disagree. That's kind of a particular permissible range of viewpoints within a liberal secular environment. So therefore, like on that level, I think that's the common world I'd like. But so it's easy for me to imagine. So if I go to Amsterdam or London or Etobicoke or Quebec City, I walk around and I feel kind of other. I don't know the layout of the streets. Maybe the languages are unfamiliar. I feel like a stranger. And I can't, maybe in some cases, I can't talk to the people on the street, so I feel kind of cut off from them. And I can't vote, so I feel sort of cut off from some of their institutions, and I can't go to their schools, and I don't pay their taxes. I'm a kind of a tourist, right? But I have a sense that they are involved in a kind of common project with me. Even that Danish person who I can't have any kind of conversation with her, but I feel like somehow we're in the same world. That's a kind of a leap of faith on my part, that in her head, she is seeing this person with a backpack on as kin. But what it's very hard for us to understand is somebody walking around Duncan or Etobicoke or Amsterdam or London and seeing virtually everybody that they see and every institution in which they might function, or every state entity, as hostile, as enemy, actively. They don't have to work very hard to see it that way. And they see the stories that bind me and you. So when you say rule of law, common institutions, agreeing not to hurt each other, and everyone kind of goes, yep, check. They would stop right away and say, well, that's a sham. That is a rule of law and a set of institutions and a set of norms and a particular common historical narrative, which is built on stolen land, that is a lie from the very beginning. Not turtles all the way down, but lies all the way down. And it has to be upended. I mean, in the radical in the literal sense, meaning related to radish, the root. Right? We have to uproot the whole thing. So, not we have to tinker with it, we have to improve it, but it's all wrong. I don't live in that common world with you. You know, you are my enemy. It's very, very hard for us, here I'm making assumptions about everybody in the room, but I'm probably pretty fair assumptions. It's hard for us to imagine people who can walk around perceiving Duncan or Toronto as foreign, angry, hostile territory. As I would, I assume, if I was, in 1942 Berlin and wearing a yarmulke, walking around, feeling that sense of, this is not really a good place for me to be. So that is the crisis, I think. And similarly, there are people on the, if you will, on the extreme end of the vaccine rejectionist perspective, and who perceive the world as being suffused with a kind of a ambient toxicity. There is a kind of a taint in the air and in all of the health systems. So this deep commitment to a kind of a natural discourse, whether that natural discourse is about food or about birth or about breastfeeding or whatever it might be. And then it comes into vaccines too. But they have also, many of them, not all, have a kind of a rejectionist stance. Now again, it's a kind of an obscene conflation of these two groups. I don't mean to say they're the same, but many of them do walk around feeling that the world is not friendly, that there's something, there's this ambient toxicity everywhere. And what we need is a radical uprooting of the existing system, which is unnatural, which is toxic, which is chemical, which is corporate, which is, all these things. The problem is some of those critiques are totally true. We did steal the land. There are, we do use pesticides a lot. It's not like they're making this stuff up. So, but what do we do? Because these aren't just claims that are made within the general framework of liberal discourse where we argue and we debate and we have political lobbying, and you try to elect your guy and I try to elect my girl, and they argue and then they pass law. That framework. But what if you thought the whole thing was evil?
But if I can just respond briefly, I feel that way a lot. I don't have trouble feeling that a level of disenchantment.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that way about Parliament Hill, have ever since 2006. Well, just about any.
What happened in 2006?
To not be overstating it slightly, but outside my little cozy home in the annex, when I go into conservative writings, during the campaigns, I just can't believe it. Vote for this guy. And we want to see so much, and the stolen land critique strikes me as absolutely compelling, and so on and so on. So many patriarchal environments, even as a man, I'm deeply uncomfortable. But to me, it's not. There's never going to be a shared set of perspectives about any of that. But isn't so? I don't know. We could have such a long conversation about this. But the common world aspiration surely ultimately has to be about primarily eschewing violence for the forms of dialogue and democratic participation that I think you're seeking to advance in your project.
Yeah, sure. But there would be situations in which probably even you would agree that maybe violence is the only solution, is the only response. Maybe under certain conditions you would say, well, I've tried everything else. The world is clearly, going off the edge of a cliff if I don't kill this person. And it's just hard for many of us to feel like we're there yet.
Right. And that's when all those channels of deliberation and conversation
have broken down. And so we have now in our culture, because of these crises I'm talking about, it's harder to have the conversation where people can say, look, there are other ways. You can elect this person, or you can not elect that person, or you can have a longer conversation with your doctor. Well, what if your doctor actually doesn't want to have a longer conversation with you? She's tired of you with your sort of fantasies about your health and the natural.
We have one more question, maybe a comment. Hannah, and
I actually had a question on that last point about your doctor not wanting to talk to you anymore, and I was wondering about the issue of authority and the vaccine problem. You were talking about that woman that had that knee-jerk reaction to the doctor trying to give her the vaccine. And when you were telling that, I was starting to think of the experiences of my own social group. In a lot of cases, it's really highly educated women who have spent their lives questioning authority. And then you get pregnant, and this wall comes down of all the things you have to do, the things you can't eat, the way you have to live your life. And I've heard a lot of questioning of that with maybe not a full response from the medical community. That's frustrating for a lot of people, and that kind of leads into not vaccinating your children, but maybe questioning when the timing is, or why you have to do it on this schedule, et cetera, et cetera. And you were also talking about Googling your symptoms, and there's a great amount of disdain for that. But on the other hand, a lot of people spend their lives researching their own issues and then walking into a situation with a professional and expecting a dialogue. And then there's a frustration that they're not getting that, and then you get that sort of that locking into a position. And I can see what you're saying, where a lot of doctors are frustrated by that, but I wonder how much is this being discussed in the medical community about maybe a recognition that patients today are expecting a different sort of relationship with their doctors, and whether there's an evolution that also has to come from the other side.
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you. In fact, I think if I had to kind of organize the authors of this book kind of along a kind of a spectrum, I was at not the far end of the spectrum where I was more tolerant or more patient or whatever, but I was sort of toward that end. And part of the purpose of the book is to be a kind of a teaching tool for young doctors and nurses, to help them understand actually how complicated health decisions are, right? So that when their patient comes in and says, I think I want just measles and mumps but not rubella, or there is no polio anymore, so I don't forget the polio thing, or I'm worried about diphtheria, but not about, and they start to pick and choose because of website X or blog Q. And trying to get doctors and nurses to take that seriously and to spend time. The younger doctors are much better, partly because medical programs and residency programs have recognized that things are more complicated. But it's a slow process, right? Like, the internet is pretty young still, and so women getting pregnant at your age are so much more comfortable on the internet, and it is so much more of a natural space for you to just enter into than that guy who is 55. For him, it's a really good encyclopedia. And he was trained not to rely on it in medical school, right? Whereas you were trained to rely on it to help you understand your own body. So I think there is some change happening in the younger doctors, many of whom there's way more women doctors coming out. They have much more training in what we call medical humanities. Now, most med schools have these programs to get doctors to be more sensitive to their patients' various perspectives. It's hard, though, frankly, because partly it's an economic question, because the doctor is paid, it's a fee-for-service model we use in Canada, for the most part. And so the doctor is seeing you for 15 minutes because if she spends more time with you, she makes $12 that day. And she doesn't want to make $12. I kind of get that. And if you want to talk about your sore knee and your concerns about HPV, and maybe you might want to get pregnant and you've read this on the blog, that's an hour and a half. And then the other 14 people have to wait, and for that hour, she makes $12, right? So that's very crass to put it that way, but that's a part of the reality of the thinking that they're going through. But yeah, anyway, short answer to your question is, yeah, it's changing, but slowly. Yeah.
So we have a brief final question from Solomon.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, very enlightening. And I guess it's going to seem a little bit like a follow-up question to the last one, but I was kind of taken back by the fact that you didn't really have a slide on this, and something that's very contemporary and just over the last couple of weeks has been unfolding is the Ontario case of the Aboriginal girl who refused to take leukemia treatment, right? And that was something that, you had this conversation as you're talking about going back and forth between both parties. It eventually escalated, obviously, to to courts and law and judicial means, right? But at the end of the day, is that a decision you're able to live with? Is that something that we're supposed to look at and just say, well, we tried our best? And how would you address that? How would you move past that? How would you continue to address doctors like that?
That's a tricky one, obviously. There are lots of situations like this, the Kyla case and a number of other cases which are kind of related to this same decision process around that little girl. The problem is, just like with that young student who was mentioned in the chapter on HPV, who else is in the room? So she's talking to this male doctor who's giving her the totally appropriate medical advice and who's actually being pretty nice about it and giving her a prescription and sending her on her way. In other words, he's actually facilitating her health, giving her choices. But in that room with that 22-year-old young woman is her women's studies teacher, her male or female friends, the people she blogs with. Okay, so it's a complicated conversation. So in fact, although the guy is saying all the right things that one might wish him to say, she is interpreting it in a way which is loaded by all these other influences, such that she doesn't even see the contradiction between what she's saying and what she's saying he said and the way she's reading it. So in that case in Ontario, I think it was Brant County, right? What else is in that room? What else is in the room? How else ought we to understand? Are we really just talking about one mother making one decision about one girl with leukemia? No, we're actually talking about a broad historical woundedness. We're talking about, in fact, it was actually triggered by her feeling insulted by the nurse. So you have that kind of trouble, right? Trouble that turns into an issue. It's a classic example of this C. Wright Mills observation. You have this woman who is insulted by this nurse who says, oh, I guess, you did a little, I think it was a sweat that she did with her daughter. I guess she's better now, eh? Some kind of throwaway, very harsh comment. And there's no immediate resolution to that trouble, that kind of, Urgh. But then all these other discourses, all these other players enter the room mentally, just like in the room with the HPV conversation. Everybody else rushes in there. You have chiefs across the country cheering for this woman's right to take her daughter out of this treatment. The only treatment that would have probably saved her daughter's life. So said all the white coat guys. And so again, I would have wanted to have turned the temperature down and just say, wait a second, you're making a big medical decision about your daughter. How about we try as much as possible to have that medical decision be based on the one hand, a respectful relationship between you and the system. On the other hand, some kind of honest grappling with the medical evidence. But the problem was, and one thing that really bothered me was everybody cheering for her having won that right to take her daughter out of that thing. And of course she died, which is what they all said would happen. Anyway, so you can never be in a room, if you're just even with your therapist or your wife or your mother, your friend, there are always other people in the room, aren't there? And part of academic life or part of just growing up is about recognizing, I reacted to him this way because he reminds me of my father. Or these other discourses, these other figures, these other influences on my imagination are always there too. So why did you buy the car you bought? That seems like a straightforward, rational decision, right? We think about health decisions, do I or do I not get my kid vaccinated for A, B, or C illness? We think of it as a straightforward question, but it's actually not. Like, why did you buy the Honda Civic rather than the Volkswagen Golf? Well, you said it was for rational reasons, gas mileage, price, whatever, but actually, there's a million different reasons you bought that car. And if a decision about a car is actually as complicated as it probably is for all of us, how much more complicated are decisions about health, right? Do I stick something in my child's arm when people are telling me it's dirty or it's going to kill him? Do I take my daughter out of this treatment protocol when people are cheering? Big, powerful people in my community are cheering for me to do that for their own ends. These people didn't know the girl, they didn't know the mother, but they have a certain vested interest in the outcome of this interaction. That is, to me, a kind of a perverse situation. So anyway, I think it's a tragic outcome. Great for First Nations political activism. 3 cheers for that, which I think is awesome. But sad for the girl, and sad for the medical system. So, one last story. I promise it's my last story. On a related theme. I had a friend who's First Nations fellow, and the pregnancy, everything was going beautifully well in the pregnancy. The last minute, the baby's heart rate just crashes, and it was a terrible rush C-section, and the baby died. And everybody, everything was going well. All of her prenatal, everything was fine. Baby dies, First Nations child, the child of a very powerful First Nations community, a leader in Winnipeg. Tremendous mystery. Now, the First Nations community has an approach where they don't do autopsies. Problem is, now the mom thinks the hospital killed her baby. The hospital, the resident who was involved in the delivery, thinks she killed the baby. The nurse thinks maybe she killed the baby. The hospital doesn't quite know whether to give money to people. And it's one of these, lose, lose, lose scenarios, which called for, I think, again, a stepping back. The problem is there's a short timeline because you have to bury the deceased very quickly. But in a situation like this, if people were a bit more respectful, a bit more informed, and I knew some of the people who were involved in the hospital's end of it, if they were a bit more informed, slow down a little bit, try to engage in respectful conversation about what an autopsy might teach us, taking any amount of tissue might teach us about what happened here, this terrible tragedy, the outcome might have been better. But again, there were other people in that room. There was strong pressure on this woman to bury her child right away in, again, a pure, a natural sort of way. But now she was left with this terrible heartache for the rest of her life. There's no easy solution. Even my solution isn't easy. But anyway, enough. So.
You can see just through the talk and through the questions and answers, one of the things I really admire about Paul's work, which is this kind of brave movement into the hardest stuff, difficult issues that are right on the tip of our tongues and in the newspapers, and the work that the CSRS does under Paul's leadership just stares hard at that, and it's a difficult set of questions, nests of issues, and we're greatly enlightened by the chance to spend an hour and a half with you talking about this. So please join me in thanking Paul for his...
Thanks, man.